Good morning and welcome to the 19th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. And as usual at this point, can I remind those present to switch off all mobile phones and Blackberries, as they can often interfere with the sound system. People in the public gallery may also notice that some members and officials are using iPads. So this is instead of the hard copies of the committee papers. The first item on the agenda is a decision to take item 4 in private. Item 4 is consideration of a draft report on access to new medicines, and as such we would normally take that in private. Can I have the members' agreement that we take item 4 in private? Yes. Thank you. We now move to agenda item number 2, which is to take evidence on the impact of welfare reform on GP services. Can I welcome Dr. Alan McDivitt, Chairman, Scottish General Practitioners Committee, BMA Scotland, and Teresa Burke, Director and Trustee, Inclusion Scotland, Chief Executive, Glasgow Disability Alliance. Can I welcome you both to our session this morning? And can I offer you the opportunity to make some opening remarks? Who have you agreed who will go first? There you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the committee. At last year's conference of the BMA, its annual representative meeting, a motion was passed about the ASA process. And I'm sure this happened because doctors wanted to express their concern about the stress and distress caused by the very dramatic changes to the whole process involved in that. And this undoubtedly causes distress to patients, and we also expressed through that motion a negative opinion on the new process that was being used. Now, I've spoken a lot about the severe workload pressures in general practice in recent years. And these changes have added significantly to that workload and pressure, especially in areas where there's a high number of patients receiving benefits. Now, in my practice, the paperwork is left to the end of the day because I prioritise patient contact. And as I get to the time of the day when my building's about to close, I may have to decide whether to do some further phone calls, patient referrals and contacts, or to do somebody's report. Now, with high volumes of reports or short deadlines, these reports start to compete with clinical priorities in my working day, and this is certainly the message that I receive from many colleagues. And yet I accept that paperwork is important to patients as well. The main pressure probably coming about from these changes is the requests that we get for further medical evidence. Now, this was 3 out of my 16 appointments yesterday morning were people just coming to talk about that. Now, it's absolutely true that none of my patients can afford to have less money, and yet employment is and being waged is arguably one of the best determinants of future health that there is. The setting of thresholds for benefits is a political decision, and rightly so, and it should be assessed independently, because GPs are unashamedly biased in favour of our patients, and we're not independent in that sense. And what we should do in the role in providing evidence is to provide factual information, but not to say who should get benefits, because whoever has that role also says who should not get benefits. And I don't want to divide my patients into the deserving or the undeserving, sick and disabled. Thank you.
Thanks. Ms. Burke?
I have something that I've prepared, so I'll just read from it. So hello and thanks to everybody for inviting me along today. I thought I'd just say a wee bit about the organisations that I'm here representing. I'm the Chief Executive of Glasgow Disability Alliance. That's a membership-led organisation made up of disabled people, and we have 1,800 members in Glasgow, and I'm a disabled person myself. But more importantly than that, I'm representing those people, and also Inclusion Scotland, which is the national voice of disabled people in Scotland, and it has over 60 members and a reach of thousands on a weekly basis. So that's why I'm here today and why I've been asked to come. Both Inclusion Scotland and GDA have got a role in bringing the voices of disabled people and people with long-term conditions to policy and decision makers, including local authorities, government and the Scottish Parliament, amongst others. My hope is that we can all work together to ensure that the views and opinions are taken seriously and keep open the lines of communication. The posters that are now up in surgeries advising patients not to ask for medical evidence to prove their care needs followed by an announcement in the Sunday Herald from Glasgow BMA, is being interpreted by disabled people as a direct attack. This has happened at a time of unprecedented and disproportionate cuts to the benefits and services and available income of disabled people in Glasgow and Scotland. Last week we had a members meeting and we do have a vast membership, and over 400 attended to the Thistle Hotel in Glasgow. And so strong was the feeling and the panic and anxiety amongst our members at that meeting that we abandoned the planned agenda to actually discuss this issue, and this was the subject of our morning conference. And it's these views that I bring to you today. So there's a number of quotes. I've already been affected by having my benefit cut and feel it's been an awful experience personally. Having a doctor's support could have made a huge difference to my outcome. This is an attack on my right to a fair trial. Surely this is part of patient care. This is extreme discrimination. What about the patient's charter? And other people are asking over and over, where else do they go for evidence and support? They feel isolated and vulnerable. I always thought your doctor would be there to provide support and evidence. So again and again, those kinds of quotes coming up. I've not had time to write this up into a full report, but I've got some of the post-its with me from the conference if people wanted to see them later. Before we even begin to discuss the impact more fully, what I would really like to emphasise is that we do appreciate what the doctors are saying about the extra time, particularly for people in deep end situations in areas of deprivation and disadvantage. We do understand that, but we also feel that this is not the problem or the making of disabled people or people with long-term conditions. So we can be part of the solution and make suggestions, but we can't be held responsible for the problem in the first place. And it seems like a really unfair and unjust punishment that the solution is to just not provide the evidence. Glasgow's disabled people are losing out in a devastating way, with potential consequences for their income, for their participation in society and their health and well-being. We feel that this is at odds with the Equality Act and the Patients' Rights Act, which commits to giving patients the right that their healthcare they receive will consider their needs, what would most benefit their health and well-being, and encourage them to take part in decisions about their health and well-being, and provide them with information and support to do so. So we feel that this all falls within that. It completely flies in the face of all rhetoric about preventative approaches. And fundamental to all of this, we feel, is a breach of human rights in terms of the rights to a fair trial. The right of access to a fair hearing, including access to an independent and impartial appeals process and the provision of welfare benefits by a state, is critical and crucial to the realisation of Article 6, and the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg ruled specifically on this issue in Kovachev versus Bulgaria in 1998. And again, I can give you more information about that, but that's a precedent that's been set. The precedence between that particular case law and the welfare reform in the UK could not be more evident. Vulnerable people needing welfare have absolutely no right to appeal decisions to anyone, let alone an independent and impartial tribunal, in clear violation of their right to a fair hearing as laid down in Article 6. That welfare reform violates human rights is in no doubt. But more important than talking about legislation is the home truth that the only way for a disabled person to challenge decisions made against them, the smallest sliver that they can get what should be a fundamental right, is for a doctor to supply medical evidence, and we really don't feel that we can do without this. The only way for a decision made poorly, made wrongly, made without evidence or involvement of the person, the only way for these decisions to be challenged is by a letter from a doctor. We feel that it's clear that this crisis facing disabled people, and at times we feel that our humanity is under attack. Arguments made in one long ago have re-emerged, and we're tired and dismayed to be fighting old fights about why we should be entitled to dignity and choices, about the most basic things like evidence of our support needs, care needs and medical conditions. At this point in time, there's lots of different things happening affecting disabled people. It's not just this issue with the GP letter, and it's got to be taken as part of a bigger picture. So we're being asked to decide, for example, those amongst us who have social work services and care support arrangements, what's more important? Do you want to get up and wash and have a shower in the morning and rest, or do you want to participate in the community? Because you can't have both. And these are ridiculous questions to have to answer, and they also fly in the face of legislation that we are signed up to through the Treaties of Human Rights. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, Article 19, says that disabled people have a right to live in their own home with what support they need and participate fully in the life of their community. And all of these things are compounding in such a way that this isn't possible. So we feel that there are complex and interrelated barriers that disabled people face at the best of times, and lack of a long-term focus, together with austerity measures such as cuts in efficiency savings, service reform, charges for social care, which have gone up in many local authorities over the last year, combined with the usual barriers disabled people face, have resulted in crushing confidence, self-worth, identity and the participation of disabled people. Add to this the hostile attitudes and propaganda about layabouts and scroungers, and what we have is what we're calling a perfect storm of forces acting against disabled people. All of this is negatively impacting on the mental and physical health and well-being of disabled people and people with long-term conditions. For the first time, disabled people are now being asked to provide medical evidence for social work services. And again, I have case stories and anecdotes that I can tell you about recently in Glasgow of people and other areas who have been asked to provide this. And what disabled people have said, particularly on Friday and last night, I spoke to a conference of over 200 of the Glasgow and West of Scotland Housing Forum, and people were saying they feel it's the last line of defence, the trust and relationship that they had with their GP being eroded. Whilst they understand and appreciate the pressure of GPs, they feel that the solution is not for the GPs to refuse to give these letters. The solution lies somewhere else. We know that disabled people in Glasgow are at greater risk of growing health inequalities and resultant disadvantage than people in other areas, and we know that that's due to the sheer scale of the numbers of people with impairments and long-term conditions, as well as the highest rates of benefit claimants. We also understand that it's the likely very reason for the introduction of this policy, that the bedroom tax would have a significant impact on GP available time to write letters of support and provide evidence. As I say, we feel this is not the correct response, and we ask that the decision be reversed. The problem is complex and challenging. I think Dr. Harry Burns calls these things wicked problems. So it's surprising and confusing to us that GPs and their representative bodies have come up with such a simple solution, because we think it would take more thinking through and a more strategic approach than this. Moreover, we feel that this will make the situation much, much worse. We're here today to ask for assistance to persuade the Scottish Government and the NHS to take seriously and implement with integrity their duties under the Equality Right, the Equality Act, the Patients' Right Act and the Human Rights Act. Doctors have already said through their national voice, the BMA, that the DWP ATOS assessment should end immediately. The General Medical Council states unequivocally that doctors must take action to prevent harm to their patients. The Patients' Rights Act, at its core, is about providing an NHS that considers people's needs, and the ECHR and rulings from the European Court clearly lay out that there's lack of an independent and impartial appeals process for welfare decisions, and that is a real violation of human rights. The only appeals process that there is, literally, the only thing between disabled people in far greater harm, either through destitution due to removal of benefits or serious deterioration in their mental or physical health through being forced to work when they're not fit to do so, is a letter from the GP, and that this is being refused is wrong, professionally, legally and morally.
For that, Bob Doris for our first question from the committee.
Okay, thank you, Convener. It was a lengthy presentation, Ms Burke. I feel there was a need to put all of that on the record on behalf of the people that you represent, so you absolutely were listening very carefully to that. I was keen to have representatives of doctors and yourselves at committee today because of representations I had from Inclusion Scotland, but also from individual constituents about posters going up in Glasgow surgeries. Now, just very briefly, the posters that went up, I'll just read a little bit from it. Part of it says, GPs provide general medical services to their patients and we are not in a position to administer nor to police the benefit system. The LMC considers that it is not appropriate for the GP to be asked for letters of support or letter to confirm care needs. And further down it says, therefore we cannot respond to your request for a letter. There's more than that within it. Now, it's not even a case of some doctors refusing a request for a letter. These posters are basically saying, don't ask in the first place. And I have a fundamental concern with that. Some of those concerns Miss Burke alluded to, and actually some of the words I'd written down were the same as Miss Burke used. I think my constituents will see it as a lack of compassion from some GPs, and I think it's a lack of compassion from the very people in their community that they trust the most, and that seeming lack of compassion will be corrosive and erode trust in the people who are the most important people in some of the most deprived communities to help vulnerable people. I should state that I don't believe any GP has a lack of compassion at all. I do not believe that is the case. It's how this will be interpreted by some of the most vulnerable people. Now, it just so happens I was in a health centre in North Glasgow on Friday for a completely unrelated reason, and GPs told me that these posters have now been taken down. I don't know if these posters have been taken down just in one health centre or whether they've been taken down across Glasgow, or specifically what the reason for that is. I think I would ask Mr McDivitt, I know you're not here to speak specifically for Glasgow, but can you perhaps tell us, have these posters been up right across Scotland? In your surgery where you saw 3 of your 16 patients yesterday, did they walk past one of these posters saying don't ask? Has your local area taken a different decision in whether patients should be deterred from asking? What is the situation for patients in Scotland? Is it in one part of Scotland you can ask for a letter but in other parts of Scotland you can't? Or in one health centre in Glasgow you can ask for a letter but in another health centre you can't? Can we get to the bottom of what GPs are doing across the country? What's happening to my constituents in Glasgow?
Absolutely, if I can answer that question. If I can first of all start by saying perhaps some of the problems with the letters in the first place. We've argued that in fact the system should ask us for this information up front. The Citizens Advice Bureau survey suggests that only 8% of ESA applicants have a report that's requested from their GP. Now, that report, and I have a copy here if anyone would like to see what we're asked to do, if anyone would like to have a look at those. But that report asks for factual information in regard to people's health. It's not an opinion as to whether they're fit for work or what the nature of their disability is. It's just factual reports of what I can actually testify to with regard to that patient. Now, we actually want to provide more of those reports, and just out of interest, we don't get paid additional money for those reports. It's part of our contracts. If the volume goes up, it's of no financial benefit to GPs. But we want to encourage that system, and in fact, we have urged the system to ask for that information in advance of making decisions on ESA for patients, because we think that's the only fair and equitable way for medical evidence to be sought and provided from ourselves. The problem with further medical evidence is that I'm in this invidious position. If I only give it to some people, then I'm partial because I feel particularly sympathetic, or I like Mrs. Smith, or I feel particularly sorry for such and such. And we get into this decision where my decision whether to provide additional information, which is private because it's not part of the assessment system, is based on whether or not I prefer this patient over another. So if I was going to give reports, I'd have to give them for everyone. Now, that's just not tenable in the volume of reports that would be required and the frequency. So it's either a case of it's fair to give no one, or it's fair to give everyone this extra additional information. So we have said it's actually much more sensible for the system to upfront, through the normal process, in a standardised and fair way, to get information which then should be used by an independent body to decide whether they're entitled to benefits. So that's why there's the all or nothing scenario, because otherwise you're being partial. And that is when I start to be in the position of deciding who deserves the benefit, who deserves the additional medical report to challenge the decision that they shouldn't be able to get these benefits. And there are some patients where the doctor won't disagree with the decision that benefits should not be continued. And there's also a huge range of opinions amongst doctors between how the benefit system should work. But that's a political arena. That's not a professional arena. We should be fair to everyone, and we encourage the system to say, ask for this information up front in a fair and standardised way. Now, the Glasgow LMC is not the BMA, and I can't speak for them. My practice, I have to embarrassingly say I hadn't seen the poster, but it would have been up because it's the advice from our local medical committee. It has been taken down because I know that in response to the comments that have been made to the LMC, they are reconsidering whether that's the right response. But I think it's still, the problem still remains, Should everyone get an additional report, or should only some people when I decide to grant them that favour? So that was one response to that particular thing. As I say, at the moment they've been taken down, it doesn't mean the problem's gone away, but because of the negative response and the way patients are taking that and perceiving it, the decision was taken to reverse that decision while they reconsider how they would deal with this problem. But it comes back to our point, which is that once again, we encourage the system to officially ask for fair and equitable information up front from us at no additional cost to the state or the patient.
I certainly want to come back and look at that in some more detail, but just for a bit of clarity, your local medical committee did initially have a policy to put the posters up in all GP practices. They have now
Actively requested to take them down.
When did that happen?
I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I couldn't be precise, but I can get you that information because it's a letter from the LMC.
That would be helpful. And did every local medical committee have these posters up in their surgeries across Scotland, or was it just some?
I think it would just be some. I mean, I think that was specific to Glasgow because the committee made that decision. Now, I suspect some others may have done similar, but I haven't actually heard of that.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted that they are reconsidering their position, because when they responded to my representations on the 9th of May, they weren't reconsidering their position. They said they had to do it and they would continue to do that. Can I just explore this a little bit further? You said that 3 of your 16 patients had requested such information in relation to benefits issue, despite the fact that the poster was up within the surgery. Do you think there was perhaps more patients that wanted to see you about that information that were deterred from approaching yourself or other GPs because of that poster?
I think I'm certainly aware some of my patients, because of my prominence in this area, have seen my comments about additional reports elsewhere, and they have mentioned that to me in discussing their requests. So patients are certainly aware of this dilemma that doctors face.
What I'm trying to get to is the most vulnerable patients seeing that poster will be the least likely to say to their GP, I know about your policy, but I still need this information. So by having that policy, it's the most vulnerable people who are least likely to ask for the support that might actually very well be appropriate for GPs to provide. So is the situation now in Glasgow that that blanket approach was just wrong?
I think I would say it's a committee decision, and as this committee does, they'll decide as a group what's the right thing to do. And within any committee, there'll be a balance of opinions. And I think there's no doubt that the negative impression that patient groups in particular have had about that decision has made that committee review that decision, and opinions have been swayed. And I think that's how I would explain it. But I think, do people change their approach? I think they do. The intention of the letter was to try and discourage anyone from asking, so we didn't have to be partial about who we would provide that. And I would have to say that I have to think very carefully if someone asks me that. I have to be fair to everyone and say I'm either going to give everyone or I'm going to give no one, because that's the only fair and equitable way to do it. It shouldn't be that someone's right to an appeal is based on whether or not I feel kindly towards them or I feel sympathetic. It should be fair and just. And I think from our point of view, the system should systematically apply a fair system for gaining medical information. The process is there. They can do it right now. They can change how often they ask for that information in advance of making a decision. And then every patient will have the same right to the information, the factual information being there when the decision is considered. And further information shouldn't be necessary in those cases.
Now, I think just for the record, I should point out, having spoken to a couple of individual GPs in Glasgow, they just continued providing the letters, and that did mean working late or taking work home and doing it. They just got on and did that. And I think perhaps they had some concerns in relation to the LMC decision. So I'm delighted that that is under reconsideration now. In terms of the wider issue, my understanding is the concern from the BMA is not all the information requested by the UK Government or ATOS is suitably, the structure for passing that information on in the first instance is flawed, that it's not always made use of in the most appropriate way when decisions have been taken, and that unless ATOS specifically requests for additional information, there's no contractual obligation on GPs to provide it. Would that be the situation?
Correct, yes. Okay.
Do you think there should be a widening of the contractual obligation on GPs to provide more information? And I put to one side the workload issues that we'll come on to that in a second. Do you think that GPs should be providing more information than they currently are?
I think is no, because we already have the contractual obligation to provide whatever is requested by the DWP, or in this case ATOS working on their behalf. So they can ask for any information they think is relevant to the process right now without changing any contract. And they have changed that because they changed the form, excuse me a second. But they also have changed the timing of how quickly they want us to respond. And that's entirely their gift to do that. So in fact, it's entirely up to the DWP and ATOS to decide what information and in which format do they wish to receive that information from GPs. And yes, there are lots of doctors who've commented on both the process and the handling of information and data, and you'll find a whole variety of views on whether that's appropriate or not. But in the very first instance, it's only used, it would seem, in 8% of occasions to ask us for that information. Now, the other thing is, I have to say, until very recently, I had never had any figures or comments as to how frequently GPs returned these forms, whether they came back in time, etc. No one has ever provided any information to say this was not working well, there was a problem. And it's probably of use to hear now the fact that 60% are done within 2 weeks, 80% are returned, and 20% never seem to appear out the system. Now, I don't know whether that's because of the post or whatever, going to the wrong doctor, I have no idea. But until very recently, in an FOI request, no one had ever pointed out there was any problem with the system. Now, as a professional organisation, we're more than happy to encourage that the system works correctly, and if there's a problem with that, to hear that information and to work on ways to make it work better. So I think it's important but that information has only very latterly come to my knowledge, and something that I'll certainly be looking at, because we accept our professional obligation to provide this information, in a contractual sense, and it's entirely up to DWP to determine the right method of asking us and what information to ask us for. But I would point out that once again, it's only factual information that we're asked for. We're only asked to attest to that which we can actually say we've witnessed or that we know. Usually it's not an opinion-based report. Now, that's often a difference from someone asking for a medical report. We'll usually ask for my opinion on something and what evidence I have for something. The DWP, I think rightly, asks for factual information I know about that patient and I can attest to personally. Because in fact, in terms of function, medical records are often very poor at saying what people can and can't do, because A, I don't see them doing it, and I don't ask them to do it in my surgery. Things like walking, etc., I can do, but for many things I can't. And so therefore, it's right that patients are asked to describe what do they actually functionally find difficult in their lives, because I'm not there to see it. And in fact, you do get into a situation where patients, knowing they're coming up for review, will deliberately come to see me to tell me I can only walk 50 yards, I can't bend for lifting more than a 2-kilogram weight, which is slightly absurd. But this is so that they get me to write it in the notes, because they know these are critical points of information that will determine whether or not they get benefits. But in fact, according to DWP, I'm not supposed to report that because that's hearsay evidence. I haven't seen it happening. But it's a sign of how desperate people are to make sure they pass the criteria, that they will come to provide that evidence to me in the hope that I will pass it on and it will have an influence on that.
Is there a variation in the quality of information that different GPs provide on these forums? Is there an inconsistency? Some GPs have told me they can answer some of the questions but not all of them, so they leave them blank. If they're not sure, they leave them blank. Other GPs try to fill in everything. Is there a need for guidance to GPs and a consistency of how GPs actually fill in these forums in the first place? Because if you get that right, that may save a lot of return visitors where claims have not been properly assessed.
Well, it's interesting that. I mean, it's partly due to the nature of different characters, whether they are voluminous in their response or they're very brief. But when I was looking and researching for coming to the committee, the DWP has a piece of research on its website which said that there were concerns that sometimes GPs were too brief in their responses. So they did a pilot where they actually went and took the patient's records and actually used that to decide on their evidence, and found that it all made almost no difference to their decision making. Now, you could take that to mean that GPs may be brief, but what they're giving is the information that's critical to the decision. That in fact, having all the evidence doesn't appear to change that. But I think there is already guidance that's out there, and there's no doubt, as various patient groups are now saying, that the way in which we present the evidence may influence the decision. And that information is something that GPs may wish to consider. But This highlight has only come about because of the failure of gathering medical information. In the first place, in most cases, they're not getting anything. But the information that's provided, by all means, we should look at how effective it is. But in fact, in a study of all information versus what we currently provide, what we currently provide appears to have the necessary effect on decisions.
And finally, sort of my colleagues will want to get in, finally, in terms of the overall workload for GPs, as I said at the start, I don't believe there's a lack of compassion. I just think GPs got this badly wrong in Glasgow, quite frankly, as a policy, but I don't think it's because of a lack of compassion. GPs are seeing a significant increase in their workload because of welfare reform. You said in your opening statement that you believe that left less time for other vital medical work you have to do for your patients. Can you, first of all, maybe give me an idea of some of the work that you think is not been carried out for patients or not been carried out in tedious a fashion as otherwise would be because of welfare reform? And secondly, how that can be remedied. In other words, does it mean more money invested for locums? Does it mean more GPs more generally? What does it mean, and who would have the responsibility for funding that? So what kind of things are not being done for my constituents in Glasgow as quickly as otherwise would be because of welfare reform, or what's just not been done at all because of welfare reform, and how can we change that situation?
If I can first of all say, and I think it's important to say, that it's not just about forms and documentation that austerity and welfare reform impact on my workload. Patients who are poor and getting poorer get more ill health. So they're more depressed, they're more stressed, they may engage in more self-harming behaviours from alcohol, drugs and dangerous behaviours. Their illnesses get worse, their chronic pain gets worse, they're more likely to end up in hospital. So that's the weight of the austerity and the changes in the welfare system that actually create the real workload. And I said earlier, we put the paperwork to the bottom of the priority pile. So we deal with the human consequences of austerity and welfare change first. That's why we object to the paperwork, because that's actually the real workload that we need to be addressing. Now, as I say, I could, at the end of the day, phone that person and try and explain their latest blood result and reassure them or try and get them to engage in some healthcare activity, or I can fill out another form for a process which I think is fundamentally flawed and is distracting me from the real business of looking after people's illnesses and improving their health. In terms of overall, I mean, I have to say, I put it back to politicians. The welfare system is a political agenda, and it's for politicians and pressure groups to decide how it works. Now, our role in that has clearly changed. Without anything on our part, we did nothing to change this. And somehow, we often seem to be to blame for it going wrong, which is a strange position to be in. But nonetheless, in general terms, general practice intensity of workload, because of what we deal with and how we deal with illnesses, there's much more we can do for people, and the effects of austerity and welfare changes means the actual clinical work we need to do with patients is now getting to the stage where many young doctors don't want to be me anymore. That's a serious problem for the future of the NHS. And it will be down to the NHS and, in fact, government to decide how that should change. We would argue for an increase in resources, that we need to massively increase in the resources in primary care, not just GPs, but district nurses, health visitors, in order to meet the demands of the population, particularly with an ageing population, but also in a population living under austerity and welfare stress.
Okay, no, I'll hold my peace on that, Mr McDivitt. I think I'll give my fellow committee members some time to come in, but I might come back in later.
Ms. Burke, you've heard that exchange, and obviously the Vice Convener was addressing. If you any comment before we move on to the next question in terms of that exchange between?
Yeah, just I suppose that disabled people and our organisations in Glasgow and Scotland would absolutely support the need for more resources. One of the suggestions that came up both last night and last Friday from disabled people was the idea of, if agencies want the evidence, then could they pay for the GPs to give the evidence, thereby creating more resources to bring in more GPs. But we accept that that would be a piecemeal and quite a fragmented approach to allocating GPs. So there was also the suggestion that more GPs need to be allocated in deep end situations to deal with poverty and disadvantaged areas where there are more benefits claimants and where this is having more impact. The other suggestion that was brought forward by disabled people was that other than their GP, nobody knows their condition better than they do themselves. But unfortunately, we're in a time of cynicism where people just wouldn't believe a disabled person, so I'm a person who has trust and confidence in my name and in what I say today, but I have MS, and if I became very ill tomorrow, I absolutely have no confidence that anybody would believe anything that I was saying. And the one thing that I know that I would cling on to is that I have a very good GP. So now I'd be very worried that I wouldn't be able to ask the GP for support. So, you know, I think asking the disabled person would be a very obvious starting point, or the person with the long-term condition, but not necessarily the one that DWP would listen to. The other thing that people did suggest was there are really good people in health, like nurse practitioners. You know, there are people in the voluntary sector, and in this time of post-Christie Commission recommendations that we're in, we know the role the third sector could play, community-based organisations, citizens advice bureaus, organisations led by disabled people. If their accounts could be taken seriously, they are very committed and well placed to provide support to people and give evidence, because I think there is a reality that the doctor's saying here, which is that often people are just going on what the patients are coming and telling them because they don't present. So I have an incurable disease, so I rarely present to my GP, and if I did, I'd be going to say, here's all my list of symptoms, can you write me a letter for access to work, you know, or whatever it might be, and my GP trusts that. But I do appreciate there's a certain irony in that. I think that it needs to be a range of measures, including the increased resources. The one thing I do respectfully not agree with is that an approach of saying we have to treat everybody fairly, therefore we'll give nobody it, is not a particularly good solution. I think it has been a naive reaction, and I completely understand where that's come from. The pressures on GPs is phenomenal, but I think that it's very clear that we all have responsibilities under human rights to ensure the right to a fair trial and a fair appeals process, and I think that that response is quite unhelpful. So I'm delighted if that's going to be reversed, and even the temporary suspension of it I think is a good thing.
Maybe return to some of that, obviously. Drew Smith.
Thank you, Convener. I listened carefully to that exchange, Dr McDevitt, and you mentioned the FOI information that's now in the public domain around the return of information to DWP. And I should first say, having met with the DPN group on a number of occasions, I'm extremely sympathetic to the issues of GP workloads and how we can improve that balance. But do you think that GPs would perhaps be in a better position to argue that case if the numbers coming back around the information that they're actually on a statutory basis required to provide were a bit better than the FOI results suggest? You know, we've got a national average figure of GPs are, when they're asked under the current contract, the stuff that they're actually paid to do, and a request comes direct from DWP at Atos, they're only returning the information within the timescales, about 58% of occasions across the country, and in some parts of the country it's a minority of occasions that they're returning the information appropriately. Now, I accept that there will be a range of issues in that. Some of that might be the DWP's fault about not knowing which GP to contract, things going missing. But the overall figure is quite stark. And would it not have been better for GPs themselves to get their house in order on those issues before expecting to be, perhaps more understood on some of these issues around, if you like, the extra letters that they're being asked to provide?
May respond to that. I mean, none of us, we don't get the letters, so I have no idea how many GPs returned them, because I don't have that information. So until the FOI request, I had no idea there was any issue. Now, the first thing you do when you get that is you say, what's the cause? And then you find out. And if it's because of us, then we have to look at how we do that. And I would point out that one of the interesting things, the new form, which is the ESA 113, says within 5 days. Now, it doesn't tell me when the patient is going to be seen or assessed. Now, returning a form within 5 days, I work Mondays, Tuesday mornings and Fridays. If it comes in, it goes in my pile on Monday night, I don't get back to it on Friday, I've already missed the deadline. And coming here doesn't help. So what I'm saying is that, a 5-day deadline is almost by return of post. Now, that seems strange to me, because I presume that the date for this assessment will have been made in advance, and there should be plenty of time to seek this evidence and give a reasonable time scale of response. But if every GP is having to, by return of post, answer these, when I invite the system to send me more, it could well break the back of the system, because I'll have to do these the day they come in order to get it back within 5 days. So if there is a problem, and it's the first time we've had a hint that there may be, Now, some of that will be GP fault, some of it may not. But I think absolutely I've already said that we're happy professionally to look at ways to enhance and improve that, because I'm also offering both the DWP and to yourselves that we are inviting more work for no extra money to try and answer this problem, because we think that's fairer and the right way to do it. And we will also look at how we improve the response times and how we improve the quality of that. And indeed, pressure groups can help us with that by knowing the right words to use, because you'll know that the way in which you say a thing can matter a lot. And many welfare rights officers tell me that it matters whether I say this could be a problem for someone or whether I don't mention it. That apparently matters a lot. Now, I'm no expert on the system, but the welfare rights officers are. And in fact, they teach me on the language. But I have to admit, that will therefore is coaching me to encourage my bias in favour of the patient. Now, we almost end up in a situation where professionals have been asked to go against the state, because the state has a system it has decided to decide on who gets benefits and who will reach the threshold. And welfare rights officers rightly tell people within the law how best to answer that in order to make it more likely to be successful. But we're also in somebody, just to be clear about the type of second report that we're often discussing here. This one is very factual and standardised. The second report is really someone asking me to provide counter evidence to the government's assessment of ability and disability. So I'm actually, so you're going to end up with two opposing views. Mine is the GP, and the other the independent, supposedly non-biased, doctor providing information as part of the state's assessment. Now that will just lead to an impasse. Either eventually the state will ignore everything I say. If every single time they make a decision I question it and provide an alternative view, they'll either ignore it all the time or they'll have to change the system. But this is all unnecessary addition. They should get it right. The proper independent system should get it right, and that's what we argue is where the concentration should be. Get that right, and there's no need for us to fight against the state's assessment, because it should be seen as fair and independent in everyone's eyes. If it's not, quite rightly, patients groups and politicians complain about that, and that's really where the battle should be, rather than a fight between two medical opinions, one from myself as a biased individual, putting it in ways that will benefit my patient, versus the state's doctor who's acting apparently independently and objectively on the basis of fact. So I think we should get the system right, rather than get into this silly situation of simply knocking heads on medical opinion at a later stage.
I understand what you're saying. I mean, the figures that Michael McMahon's been able to put in the public domain, I mean, that relates to the 14-day period, so presumably we can assume that where there's a request for a 5-day period, it would be even higher, yes. that the lack of compliance with that, and I accept there's an issue about how realistic that timescale might be, but the fact of the non-compliance remains. Could I maybe ask you about the charging regime, so moving on from the evidence that you're under contract to provide and the other evidence that you might be asked to provide? What is the BMA's view around or your own view if you're not able to give a BMA view on the consistency of how we achieve it, and whether it's desirable to achieve a consistency of a charging regime, because we do seem to have a very wide variation across the country from a few pounds to almost £100 being taken from patients.
I'm happy to say that. There's two things. When someone asks me for a private report, and if we just say any private report, I could opt to do it for free and do it as a charitable act of some type. And that can be for people going to parachute for a charity, to getting a job in Sierra Leone or something like that, so, or just to get a job or anything. If it's a private report, because it's not part of my job and they're not going to pay me for it, then it's charitable work that any of us could get involved in. Again, most GPs are very conscious of fairness, and we shouldn't just do favours for the people we like. So therefore, either you do charitable acts consistently, or you alternatively say you can do that, but you have to pay a fee for that. Now, it's interesting that we used to in the BMA set fees and recommend fees for different types of activity. Now, the BMA is now on its third and final warning from the Competition Commission and the Office of Fair Trading for price fixing, and is no longer allowed to advise GPs on how any private work is priced. In fact, it's illegal for two GPs or practice managers to discuss pricing on that issue, because it's against competition law. So therefore, there is no standardisation. We're not allowed to talk about it. So each practice has to say, and have a system to say, if somebody wants me to do private work, and you all need us to do it because you wouldn't get a mortgage, you couldn't claim for compensation, you couldn't go to court without private medical work being done. So most systems will have just a standardised system that says this is what it costs to get GPs to do private work. And anyone can ask us to do that. Now, it would also seem unfair for me to say that I would refuse to do it, and I appreciate it's a dilemma. Would some doctors might provide a private report for the medical evidence where they wouldn't do it voluntarily. And that can seem a dilemma, but it's also that issue if somebody decides it's worth paying for, should I refuse to take money from someone on benefits and take it from someone who needs it for a legal report? So there's all these kind of dilemmas, which is why we want to cut it off at the earlier stage and say, let's get that evidence into the right place where it doesn't cost the individual any additional funds, and we will provide it in a fair and standardised form. So just to put back to the reason for the variation in fees is no one can actually do that. We can't price fix it. We can't advise on it. It's not legal to do that. It's not even legal for two practices across the room, across the corridor to do that. So therefore, it will always vary. It depends on the volume of private work they have and how they decide to price their time. In most cases, that work will be done in GP's own time, and they will price it accordingly. And there's no method that I know of that you can legally have any influence on that, and neither can I.
That's very interesting evidence, and I think it's something that we want to come back to. Could I maybe just finally ask you around the specifics of the bedroom tax, which seems to be the impetus that led to this particular poster from Glasgow LMC, and a question for both of you, if you can, and that really is around whether or not GPs are actually the best placed people to be providing some of the information that is being requested, particularly around under occupancy, when the issues around that may not be medical at all, and actually whether or not a GP is best placed to give an indication of someone's care needs over and above actually the individual themselves, their carer, the social work department, and other people that they might be in contact with.
I can say it's a habit of all organisations, particularly state-run organisations, that whenever they have to ration a service, the first thought is get a doctor's letter. It's a phrase that every GP knows. Patients come in and say, I've been told to get a doctor's letter for my gardening to be done in the summer, for my wheelie bins to be taken out, to get a bath installed in my house, to get a shower, to get my carpets relaid, you name it, anything, to get central heating installed. We've had that whenever there's been the very laudable process where people got central heating installed, but many of them could only get it if I said they could have it. I remember one particular daft instance where a lady came to see me and said, the social worker says I need a new bath, the district nurses say I need a new bath, I think I need a new bath, but they'll only give me one if you write me a letter and say I need a new bath. Now, I've never seen her bath. I'm sure she needs one, but why did it come to me? And the answer is that many people, their first stop in any rationing is to say, get a letter from your doctor and you can have this benefit bath, whatever. So basically, again, we're in the same situation in the bedroom tax. We would rather people were believed, people self-stated and self-declared their issues, because actually they know them best. Now, if you don't believe them, occasionally go and check. Now, this happens with housing. If I can take us back, for many years in Glasgow, everyone who wanted a new house had to get a doctor's letter, because basically you didn't get any priority without one. So you had to get medical points to have a chance of getting a house. So that meant every single person applying for a house had to get a doctor's letter, and your success in getting a house seemed to depend on how well your doctor wrote the letter. Absurd, irrational and unfair, because it shouldn't be up to me whether you get a new house. It should be an independent and fair decision. So we went to a system with Glasgow Housing after many years where we said patients should self-declare their problems that relate to their housing, because in fact it's usually not the diagnosis, it's function again that matters for most people. And only occasionally, if they didn't believe it or felt it was too complex, they would write to GPs. Since they introduced that in Glasgow Housing, almost no GP reports have been required. So patient self-declaration has been found to be effective, fair, and a way of getting prioritisation in housing. Now, if it can work there, why can't it work elsewhere? Now, it often comes down to trust. That in some way, if I say what a patient tells me, it's more believable than if they say it. Now, that's an absurdity and a waste of everyone's time. So we have often said, and we frequently do, the first thing should be self-declaration. If you have some reason not to believe that, or you need objective evidence, you send someone out to check, look at the bedroom, see what it's being used for, find out who's living in the house, because I don't know that. It's the same as with the wheelie bin letter. I'm asked to declare that somebody has no one else in the house or neighbours who could do it for them. How am I supposed to know that? But that is the norm of rationing in many state-run systems, and produces, I can give you books of this type of thing, of where we are asked to discern and ration services, particularly state services of one sort or another. And there are numerous, I could entertain you for hours on stories of that. But I think it's just an example of it's about We think it's effective and trustworthy to ask the patient. If you need to check a fact, you send somebody to check the fact. And occasionally you might need more detailed medical evidence, but in most cases you don't. So that's would be my response to that one.
Could you repeat the question?
It's really, I suppose, around this whole issue around Glasgow seems to, you know, there's essentially an argument of officialdom going on here, and GPs are caught up in part of that, actually around a whole range of issues about GPs' workload, and this is just one function of it. But the disabled person is the person who loses out. They're the person who, the poster's up, suddenly I can't ask that anymore. And actually the extent to which that those individuals, what their view would be about who the appropriate people that they would want to be involved in assisting with their application. So whether actually they feel that there's a need for my GP to be involved in this, or actually I would rather that I was believed, or I would rather that my carer's opinion in this could be taken into account, or a neighbour or a social worker or whoever else might be the appropriate people. Because you know, it seems to me that if you've got a long-standing condition that means that you have a care need, that's not really, you know, a medical matter that you need to see your GP about routinely to, you know, say who stayed in my house last night and how did they help me. So it's just if you wanted to add anything around that.
Yeah, I think ideally disabled people and people with long-term conditions want to be believed and would prefer not to have to go bit with the begging bowl, you know, and your tail between your legs to your GP and tell them your life story when particularly if you've not been somebody who's presented all the time. But that's just not reality. That's not where we are. Disabled people are not believed. My colleague and friend recently took the first bedroom tax appeal in Glasgow to a judge in the last few weeks, this was, and the problem with the situation is the subjectivity of it. It was a couple, the wife and the woman in the relationship was a disabled person herself in receipt of DLA, but had they had an extra bedroom, she could have conceivably moved. The DLA and the fact that she was a disabled person wouldn't necessarily have stopped her moving, but they had a son with autism, and this was the problem, that he couldn't handle change and he couldn't move. The judge just could not get his head around it. It was unlikely that a judge in Glasgow was going to turn that, you know, was going to find favour for the person anyway, because it's going to need to go further, I think, for that. But the problem is that we're dealing with subjectivity. What I would like to pick up on is Alan's point about professionals, in this case GPs, but I would argue that social workers are increasingly finding themselves in this position as well, being asked to go against the state. And this presupposes that the state is actually predetermined to protect the most vulnerable, which it should be. But what we're finding is, who is the state in this case? What is the ideology that's driving welfare reform? Is the purpose of welfare reform to protect the most vulnerable in our society, to protect human rights, to make sure that people have a fulfilled life, or even a semi-decent life? Many disabled people would argue no, that is not the case. And if that's the case, we cannot assume that the state and independent GP assessment is going to be factually correct and therefore lead to an appropriate outcome. In fact, the evidence is to the contrary, because we know that 40% of the cases turned down win on appeal. So we're absolutely certain and have evidence right in our faces that we can't rely on the state. So unfortunately, despite the fact that we might know it's not the best scenario, we do need GPs at the moment. We really, really need our GPs, and we need to be able to work with them. What disabled people in our organisations would argue is they need to be resourced to do that, because clearly they're struggling, particularly with the disadvantaged areas.
But the other thing that's came across, I think, from Dr McDivitt is that doctors are reluctant to be truly independent here. And there is a time when they don't want to be the person. The social worker or the doctor doesn't want to be the person who's confirming a decision which is denying benefit. And I can understand why they don't want to be in that position, because that's the trust broken forever. And your campaigning point is that doctors should take a line that supports every case that's turned down. Ultimately, they should be saying, I'm taking from, I mean, just examine it. You're saying we need our GPs at this time. Every single case needs the
saying
support.
that.
Well, what are you saying? I mean, is this a point here that I'm...
Well, I haven't heard the point being made in the same way that you're suggesting, but if what's been said is that the GPs have taken the decision and put the poster up because they don't know whether their patients are telling the truth, that's a different matter. And I wouldn't be advocating that they provide false evidence at all.
No.
So if they have reason to believe that the patient is lying, if there's some sort of pattern of behaviour or there's some sense that these symptoms can't be related to the condition they've been diagnosed with, absolutely not are we saying that they should provide false information.
No, but I've been listening for quite some time now, but I think we've moved on beyond the notice. I think your campaign and good representation, and indeed maybe this committee deciding a couple of weeks it was going to, people are going to have to account for all of that, and we appreciate Dr McDivitt's appearance here, although not the people who are responsible for putting the notice up, but anyway. But I think we have moved on now to how people can be helped and looking to people that trust, whether it be social work or in the GP practice. And that will inevitably mean sometimes that they are not able to support that appeal. And I think that's another aspect here that is difficult for GPs, that they do not want to be in a position where they are saying, no, we cannot support you. I think, was that some of what you were saying, Doctor?
That's very true, Mr McNeill, because we have to look after people throughout their whole lives, and hopefully most people are not on benefit all that time, but for some of them it is sadly that way. But what's important is I'm able to help them with their illnesses and to cope with life. I help people to decide, make the decisions that will make their lives better and stay healthy. And it does sour that relationship if suddenly they lose a lot of money to survive. And it is ironic, and I probably have to say as a personal statement, that it's always ironic that in the middle of a time when there are least available jobs that people are suddenly put out to try and find them. Because I actually do believe that work is good for people, that staying endlessly in poverty or on benefit with illnesses is not good for my patients. It's also true that diagnoses don't stop. I've got patients with cancer who work, I've got patients with MS who work, I've got patients with spina bifida who work. So even with quite severe disability, with the right support and the right type of work, you can work, and it enhances your life and it significantly improves your health. So I actually believe in getting people to work. The problem just now is, and I have to say just from a GP perspective, my patients are faced with simply getting a cut in benefit and an increased amount of stress trying to find jobs that may not be there. So that's not good for them. So I find it very hard to say that to somebody, even if I might say in medical grounds they're kind of whether they should or shouldn't get the benefit, giving this person less money and more stress is not good for them. And I don't want that decision. It's not the role I have with them. The predominant role is to be their doctor, not to say you can't get the benefit. And we have to remember, because of my professional obligations, if someone asks me to do a report, whether they pay for it or not, I have to give the facts. And if the facts say you shouldn't get the benefit, somebody could pay for a report. You can't make the assumption because you pay me for a report, it will say, and definitively you'll get the benefit. It may definitively say you won't, because all the evidence I have suggests you don't meet the threshold. Because professionally I have to be honest and true and put what I think is the case and defend it. So we need to remember that. It's not always about saying that getting my letter or report will definitively mean that you've got absolute support for your case, because it will just tell the truth and the facts, albeit perhaps in words that might be more inclined to support than not. But I think it's important to realise that. But it shouldn't be my decision about whether or not I give an additional report. I'll come back to this, because I feel sorry, and I do feel sorry. My approach to this in the past was always, if I felt the state had been manifestly unjust in a decision it had made, I would write a report for free, entirely giving my view as an advocate for the patient. I'm sure MSPs around this table have done exactly the same thing. And I have always said that, but that should be the exception. When it becomes the norm for people to be certainly given a more harsh decision, the threshold appears to be much higher to get benefits. As a non-expert, that seems to be my impression coming from patients. So patients are being distressed by that change. And so that's almost the norm, that many people are now distressed by both the process and the decision, and that's the country's decision, and it's a political decision to change the thresholds for benefits. And when that starts to be more normal, and it becomes normal for people to have to appeal to me for additional information, it becomes, the system is wrong and it's not working correctly. So we're trying to fight back to a rational position of fairness and equity for all. We're volunteering extra reports for nothing extra to us if the system asks for them, and we'll do our best to get them in time. That will have a cost to the system, and it will mean I will spend less time on other things that patients need, but if it's necessary, then it's necessary.
In this adversarial system where people are caught in this crossfire, if you like, and you know, and sometimes blaming the wrong people, shooting the messenger for something else that's been done for them. Is there an opportunity, I suppose, rather than the notice going out, to actually, you know, if we've resolved this issue, I'll go back, we resolved this issue in terms of the allocation of houses. We've resolved this situation in terms of the private sector or the legal requirements of the employment. So there's a general guidance or knowledge. I presume that GPs are not for insurance or legal purposes or employment purposes. They're not doing their own thing. There'll be a standard model there, or practice. It will address 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions, or you'll have an idea. It wouldn't be burdensome. It wouldn't be individual, is it? Or
It's unfortunate because each practice is an individual unit and organisation with a separate contract and legal status. And the BMA, for example, can't make practices do anything, neither can the LMC. They provide advice to try and help people make a decision in this. Because if every single practice had to sit and have the debates that we're having, they'd never see any patients. So they have to make a decision when faced with it.
and the response would be, there'll be general standard, you know, a standard report in terms of a legal requirement, insurance requirement, and employment requirement. There'll be no standard elements of that at all.
Different bits. I mean, most organisations, if they do it a lot, whether it's insurance, they'll provide a standard report, and where they're sensible, they'll discuss it with us, and there will be a standardised form. But in many cases, it's, for example, any legal letter or this type of letter, somebody has to ask me a question for me to answer it using the medical evidence. That's what a medical opinion report is.
I suppose what I'm trying to get to is that if we can resolve some of these issues over time about the allocation of houses, or indeed I see food banks now and you know, and other things that are writing to GPs about, you know, is this person, you know, a deserving person?
I mean, am I going to say no?
Well,
Just ask yourself that question.
But it seems to me, rather than the local medical committees, you know, coming up with a very reactive and indeed, you know, put a barrier between themselves and patients and things with that notice, if the same sort of effort had been put in, even at your level, to have a round table with some of the campaigners, you know, yourself at BMA, we could have created some sort of guidance and standard that would be available to people, rather than that approach. That's, you know, it mystifies me that we got that approach when there is no basic disagreement between those who are campaigning on behalf of the most vulnerable, GPs who want to help their patients. Why are we in a situation that those people haven't come together to provide guidance in terms of the language, guidance in terms of the questions that you would self-answer, and you'd be proactive in a pro forma, and this is what you would do to provide information. Is any of that work taking place? Could it take place? And if not, why not?
I think the answer is yes. The BMA, following its decision last year, the BMA as an organisation has met and is planning to meet with further disability groups. I think the timing, people might disagree with how quickly it's happened and whether it's happened in the right timing. But the BMA is taking forward action in that through its, in a sense, acting politically on behalf of doctors who have made those statements. We have also been quite clear, and this happened at our local LMC conference this year in Scotland, we've been quite clear about how we think this should be solved, and I've repeated it again today about the DWP using its ability to get those reports up front. I think that's the answer to much of this. So I think we have done that. It's probably the pace of change, and I think the building swell of distress in the community has overtaken our activities. We are just one political pressure group, the BMA as such, and other political pressure groups have the same task. In fact, in many ways you would say groups like Dressers, that is their main reason for being. Ours you know, you might say the BMA has had some other issues to deal with government now at UK level recently. So, you know, it's not its only business. So there has been work going on with this. There's continued work planned on this. We have responded to quite a number of reports on how we think should change. I think the LMC thing is, Glasgow, in the sense, is bound to be the place where the heat rises in this because of the sheer volume of patients on benefits and the need. So that was probably where the pressure first came out. And when faced with practice saying, I don't know how to decide this, what do I do for these poor people? And the answer for them was this answer. Now, you could say perhaps has come over as insensitive. That certainly is what a lot of patients might feel. But I would also say, if you asked me today, do I do additional reports? If I was to say yes, that would distress all the patients for whom I haven't done that, even if I do it on only very extreme occasions. So even come out and saying, if the Glasgow LMC come out and say, yes, everyone can, and then we can't do it, you know, so they're in a dilemma. There's no right answer to that. So the LMC can shut up and stop saying it and leave it entirely up to individual GP decision.
The BMA about the increasing workload, you know, it would come out of the welfare changes. Did you believe then, the BMA believe, that that was resolved because you had a contract in place and I presume remuneration at some point for what you do and what you're contracted to do? Was that was that the sole concern then of the BMA? That if you had the contract in place?
Nothing has changed. I mean, that, to be honest, that's an age-old part of the contract, which is almost kind of very vague. It's not specified. It's always been there since the NHS started with NHS
right.
contracts.
So the BMA did not envisage an increased workload or time or cost to GP practices as a consequence of the welfare.
Well, you could actually argue, if you say that they're only doing 8% now, my impression might be we might have less work under that because they're not asking us so often for our contractual role. If they're not asking as often for patients to get it as part of the system. Now, I don't know because I don't have those statistics, but in fact, the volume of work for the standard form, if it's only 8% of reviews, might actually be less than I used to do under the old IB 113s because the DWP has decided not to ask me for that information. So, bizarrely, in actual contractual terms, I may have to do less work, I don't know, than I used to do.
So the work comes from the appeal?
No, the work now comes from the appeal, which is actually a private collection of data to contest the state's view. Right. The state having not asked me for a view.
What information has the BMA got on the volume of work on GP practices? Because we've heard from your submission, you know, and from your own personal experience yesterday. So how many GPs in Scotland are being buried by this type of work, Carl?
Well, to be honest, I have to say, not just on this work, but in all areas we have been saying that general practice now maxed out. We can't make any more hours in the day, and we're having to make very difficult decisions, not just about paperwork, but about clinical work that we might do for patients. We're also at a time when the nature of our work is changing. The government wants, quite rightly, us to look at anticipatory care planning for the elderly, looking after sick people in our homes. It's the right way and we have to do it. So if we're going to change that way, we're already in that change. We're not waiting for it to happen. So we're under maximum pressure at present, not just to do with this. Now, we are trying to gather some data because people like figures. I can tell you that one of the GPs in Glasgow has told me she's done a calculation and 12% of her work is based on the additional information requests for this purpose.
But that will not be uniform throughout the country.
I don't think it will be. It'll depend on, because remember the reviews are going on, I think, over till 2014, and they usually do it in batches. So an individual GP might get enormous pressure one month and nothing the next month. So I don't know how they're going to do it. They may do all of one area in 1 6 months, or they may spread it. I don't know how they do it. So it will vary depending what it's the DWP that leads the workload.
We don't know the extent of the problem across the GP practice. We don't know.
No.
There's no. Ms. Burke, have you got any facts and figures in terms of individuals across the country that would help the GPs understand the scale of the problem? Or is there any factual information, or is it anecdotal?
Yeah, the bedroom tax, we know that 8 out of 10 people affected by it have a disabled person in their household. So is that the kind of thing you mean?
No, we were aware of these general facts because we're discussing here the impact on GPs.
No, we don't have that information.
You don't have that,
no.
and the GPs don't have that.
No.
If I may, Mr. Mayor, the problem of measuring workload is it takes time to do it, and when you've got no time, again, should I spend time in counting my workload to defend myself, or should I spend it on patients?
But it is a
valid point.
Has your GP contract not been renegotiated, or is that? Is that negotiation still taking place? Or?
Well, I think you could say it's been going on every year forever. I mean, the GP contract is a constantly changing thing. We have a Scottish variation of the UK contract this year, a significant Scottish element of that. But I have to say the contract in terms of this is almost irrelevant, because the state has the power to request all the information it requires from us now for no additional cost, because it's just built into the core contract from years ago. So it's not specifically, I don't get £5 more for doing another form. I just have to do whatever they ask me, whether it's 8% or 100%, my income doesn't change. So I think the contract is irrelevant to the question, because you have, the DWP has the power to ask me 100% of the time for this information for no additional cost. So it's not a contractual issue.
Cost. What do they pay you now?
There is nothing specified in the contract to pay for this. It's just a condition.
The overall.
If you have an NHS contract, you must respond.
So the additional workload that you're receiving, as a result of the welfare changes that you've outlined and all of the other pressures on you in austerity, that you haven't raised those with the Scottish Government in terms of your you have raised those with the Scottish Government?
We have in general terms about the overall
because you've
pressure.
explained to them you're so busy and they'll need to pay more to do other things.
Yes, we are.
So despite the fact that you can't quantify it in any real term, it's part of your negotiations with the Scottish Government.
It's certainly part of our discussions with them at all points, both publicly and in our negotiations. We are pointing out that general practice is maxed out, and we need to build capacity. And it's not just, and I must emphasise, not just GPs, because we don't work in isolation. We need more social workers, we need more district nurses, health visitors, pharmacists even. So we need, it's about the community capacity to deal with what is needed for healthcare in Scotland's communities. It needs to be changed, and we need to start investing in community healthcare, and that's part of this overall picture. And as soon as you task any of those workers to do a new task, it will take away from something else. There is no capacity to say you can just add a bit more, because there just aren't any more hours in the day.
Nanette Miller.
Referring to the form you currently have to fill in that might arguably give you little less work than that type of form previously. And you also have said that you would like the full amount of information to be asked for up front as far as the system. If that was the case, which presumably would mean a fundamental redesign or a redesign of the form you're filling in, or extra information on the form you're currently filling in, how do you think that would equate in workload? Would that bring anything up to the extra workload you're currently facing? Or
possibly I might not be here next year because I'm saying this, to be honest, because my job is to represent people, and I'm offering to give them more work for no extra money. That's effectively what I'm doing here, and that's not a good position for a union representative to do. But the reality is that that's the only rational and fair and undistressing way of resolving the situation and getting us away from being to blame for the situation into being having a rational system. It's the politicians and pressures group job to fight over how the actual DWP standards and processes work. Technically, that's not my job, except as another person with a political view. But in terms of how do I relate to my patients, how do I make sure it's fair, how am I fair and equitable, the answer is I fill in these forms when requested. Now, if I can just say, it's not the form that needs changed, it's the frequency with which it is requested. Now, I'm quite happy to look at how we do the content and how we can improve on that. That's a separate issue once we know whether there's problems with that. But I'm not saying the form needs reason. I'd actually think the form broadly is sufficient for us to give the necessary information. It's not all the information that patients may think is relevant to the case, but it's certainly sufficient for the information that I have to hand and that's reasonable and right for me to provide. So I think the form is okay in that regard. But I think it's the frequency with which I'm asked to fill it out is one of the fundamental flaws in the current system. But I am, by doing that, inviting, despite all the statement I've just made about pressures of work, more work. I have to say 5 days is just madness. I didn't even notice when they changed that, because I almost can't do that myself. I cannot meet a 5-day deadline, and it doesn't say when the patient's going to be seen. So we're going to get worse, I can say, but that's out with my hands, because the DWP can just change these things on its own, because that's what the contract says.
Bob and Drew.
Right, just for clarity here, contractual obligation to fill out these forms at the first time of asking from ATOS and DWP. Okay, so that has to be done within 14 days, now within 5 days. The additional workload is coming from when a negative decision is reached by the, and to use your word, apparently independent doctor or supposedly independent doctor. I think we could read into that your views, Mr McDivitt, is when they then go back, individual constituents go back to yourself or to myself actually and say, here's a decision, I've got a fluctuating health condition and more generally it's deteriorated. And I quite often write letters to doctors saying, can you reflect this in a letter back to myself so I can give it to DWP? And I've actually been in a situation where members of my staff have volunteered to accompany individual constituents to the appeals process because advice agencies are so overwhelmed and they're willing to do that. It's not often we can do it, but they are willing to do it. So it's that appeals process where there is no statutory obligation contractually unless it's again requested by DWP or ATOS. Is that the situation? Yes. Okay. So as let's deal with it as a workload issue. Okay. You said you haven't quantified across Scotland the amount of forums that have been filled in the first instance, or how many requests from MSPs or CAB or Inclusion Scotland or whoever have been requested for doctors to do letters. Now, the no-brainer for any trade union, I suppose, would be you have to quantify the increased workload before you can make effective representations to your employer in terms of getting greater recompense. So in the case of ACOS and DWP, it's the UK government, it's that element of the GP's contract and their UK-wide policies that are putting additional pressures on individual GPs. Is that process of quantifying the additional workload, not guesstimating, one GP tells me it's an additional 12%, I've had this or whatever, are you actually doing a proper trial? Because that is something that could be done. Yes, it's time consuming, but the whole point is you have to have the data, you have to have the evidence to say to the DWP, this is the increase in workload. We don't believe the GP contract reimbursement adequately reflects that. We want to renegotiate. Where are we to getting those figures rather than anecdotally?
Well, the first thing is DWP has them because they determine how much they want and they get the responses. They're the only people who have the data. The BMA doesn't have that because it's not some figures that we would have. So only the DWP presumably has all that data on response times, etc., and they were able to provide it on FOI requests. So clearly they are in the position to say how many requests come in. But what we're saying here is that to some extent, and I don't want to argue from their case, but these additional reports are not part of their process. Now, they do mention the letter, which is another point. They invite people to find new medical evidence, which we think is wrong, because if they think that should be part of the process, they should seek it, is our view. But they ask people to go and find additional medical evidence, but it's not formally part of their process, so it's a completely independent. What they're asking, inviting the patient to go and find an alternative medical view to contrast with the official view of the organisation and their assessment. If I come back to the doctors who do these assessments, I have to say I don't envy their task. Because one of the questions you have to ask is, do you want doctors involved in this at all? Now, if you do, you want a doctor generally who's not got a personal therapeutic relationship with you, because that's very difficult. But that doctor has to apply the standards and processes as set by the DWP. And they have to follow that guide. So they will follow that faithfully. Now, the reason I said, I questioned perhaps the independence argument, because lots of patient groups have said, perhaps not the doctors are not independent, but the process is slanted against the patient. I think that's many patients and groups have said that. But the doctors, in fairness and professionally, they have to follow the process that's outlined by the DWP, because to do anything else would be to be not independent and unfair to do it. So some patients and not for others. So the process should be transparent, clear and straightforward and set out, and you either meet it or you don't. Now, the patients, quite rightly, I think, have said the system is inadequate in gathering the information, it's not gathering the right information, and it's failing to do the job it's set out to do. And that's a legitimate thing to say, to challenge that whole process. And I think they should do that.
I'm deliberately trying to steer away from the rights or wrongs of welfare reform. I mean, I think most people in this committee are on record of being deeply concerned by them, you know, brutal reforms affecting the most vulnerable in society. But I've steered away from all of that because they are happening. That's the situation. This is the Health and Sport Committee. What can we do to assuage the health needs of our constituents that are going unmet because of this? So, slightly concerned about the BMA could consider how they can, from their end, quantify that additional workload onto GPs and GPs practices, and whether that's another FOI or constructive discussions with the DWP. But also what I said at the start of this evidence session was what's not getting done because of this additional workload, because that then puts it back towards a Scottish Government dimension where perhaps there is a Scottish healthcare priorities that are not being met because of additional pressures created via a UK welfare reform agenda, which is having financial implications on the ability of GPs to do other things that are negotiated at a Scottish level. And if you're able to quantify that, so then that would, I suggest, strengthen the hand of GPs both to the Scottish Government and to the UK Government, and perhaps drive some change around how resources are allocated. So what I would ask you is, are any steps underway to start to quantify what's not been done because of this? Because you're on record as saying, look, these posters went up, perhaps that was ill-considered, we're reviewing that just now, we've taken them down at the moment, but actually, by and large, GPs just tend to do these forums, you know, we want you to try and make a more consistent system. So you're doing the additional work anyway, that means other work's not getting done. What is it that's not getting done? Can you quantify that? And are you making those representations to both the UK and Scottish governments?
A couple of things on that. One is that it perhaps doesn't emphasise what my day is like and what the GP's day is like, and the intensity and volume of decisions that we have to make. I don't have time to start recording stuff because I can't get the stuff. I don't finish all my work at the end of the day. I do what I can't go home. If I can't sleep without doing something, then it gets done before I go. So I think the intensity is such that it doesn't, to say that we could sit and start looking at what we didn't do because I did this, because what happens is it just goes in the pile of stuff I must do tomorrow. So I have to say, I think that it would belie the nature of our work to say that we could just, that's a straightforward thing. And to be honest, there are other pressures which are at least as large around early discharge from hospital, multimorbidity, the elderly pop, which are actually having a much bigger effect on pressures and more pressing clinical need than this element of administration, which is what this is. And as they, just to come back to your point about the union aspects, we never came at this from a point of view saying we want more money to do more of this. Much of this we don't want to do at all. We want it to be part of the standard fair system that happens and not have to get into complex appeal and complex medical legal cases, because it should be fair, transparent, and everyone should say this is as good as you can get the system. The fact that it's not is what we have been focusing on, rather than saying let's create a system where you generate a lot more income for GPs by producing, either for the DWP or the patient are going to pay for all these extra reports because the system's faulty to begin with. So we're not arguing for more money for doing this. We don't think it should be done. It shouldn't be necessary. It should be done right the first time, and we shouldn't create all this additional false extra work. So we're not arguing for more money to come from that. You're right, we are arguing it's one of the major pressures in us right now about how we do the day job, but it is just part of a big, large mix, and we will do that. And we are looking at ways, because we are often criticised because we haven't produced figures. How many phone calls did I deal with today? How many patients I've even seen is quite hard to get, because it takes time, resource and money to do that. But we are starting to do it because it's a weakness of primary care that we can't just trot out figures and say X, Y and Z. Some of that's because they're heads down getting on with the work. But we accept the weakness in the arguments, and we are looking at that.
Just ask you, I mean, I get the fact that it could be rather bureaucratic to do a full audit of everything you do. Do you do a national survey of GPs across Scotland and ask them some general questions where they can report some of this stuff? So it's yet another forum I hear Mr McDivitt thinking, but you know, as a one-off to try and capture some of that information, because I know that the BMA make challenging but constructive representations to the Scottish Government over all the other things you mentioned. And what I'm suggesting to you, if the DWP welfare reform agenda is an additional pressure which is impacting on your ability to do all these other things that the Scottish Government is asking you to do, that's got to be part of the mix of discussions. So it's not a light touch way of trying to quantify that, because actually what we might be doing is trying to strengthen your arm in some of these discussions.
And in fact, that's when I report back, I mean, because it's a female GP in a very deprived part of Glasgow did personally do that, so she's actually decided that is exactly what she needs, and her view is 12% of her current workload is exactly around this issue. So that's the first quick and straightforward thing of one GP's experience in a deprived area. Now, yes, I think data does help, and I think we will be looking at that. But when we're talking about, you gather data to get your main political objective. In our case, the BMA's objective is to get the system to work right and get this form done properly, not to create a whole tail of additional stuff that needs done. So anything that we do in terms of gathering data will be focused on trying to emphasise that argument, because that's the direction we want to go in trying to find a solution to this very complex and difficult problem.
Smith?
Vera, Dr McDivitt's kind of a few times, suggested, I think we do need to look at this in the round and all the other pressures you mentioned, housing, adaptations, the whole gambit of things, pressure of moving people through the hospital and back out the hospital. Is it fair to say that there either is or we're approaching a workload crisis in primary care?
Yes, I think that's absolutely clear. For a number of reasons. I mean, I say the nature of what we do has changed, the complexity of what we do have changed, and the population is changing, and the health needs are changing. And in fact, I think government is quite rightly focused on looking at 2020 about saying we need to prepare now for the demographic change that's happening now. We have to change the way people are cared for medically and by carers in the community in a substantial and significant way. And to do that, we can't just do the... When I started in general practice, people were sick, they came to see me, they went away. Broadly, that was it. Then we start bringing people in to say, you've got angina or asthma, we want to prevent you getting sick, so let's work on the best package for you and do a plan. And we've been building that for years and years, where most chronic diseases will now have some type of plan and annual review, all intended to maintain health and avoid illness. So we've got that. We then have the health promotion agenda, stopping people smoking, reducing alcohol, dealing with harm. But there's still a lot of crisis occurs. Probably about 30% of every GP's work in the day is somebody presenting that day with something that's happening now. The rest may be more planned because somebody's worried about the health, will take a bit longer. So we still have an acute demand to deal with. We've still got people who are concerned about their health, and then we've got chronic disease and we've got anticipatory care planning. Now, the nature of what the community health does is fundamentally changing and must change for Scotland to survive and for the NHS to cope with what's changing and what's happening now. So that, and just on that basis alone, we need to increase capacity to deal with that new agenda. Now, we've reached capacity for all the things we're doing now, I would say. We have reached that now, and one more thing doing that means one less thing doing something else. And that's a difficult balance to make on an everyday basis. It's also true, and I would, as a personal comment, that many young doctors don't want to be me anymore. They don't want to work the way I do with the intensity I do. We have a much more feminised workforce, so it's going to change how things are impacted. People don't want to work the long hours that many older GPs have been used to. And yet this is the workforce that we need. We need to make sure general practice is attractive for young people to come into, to service the needs of the NHS and the people of Scotland. So we need to make sure that's attractive, and we need to make sure the capacity is there to do what all of us here will be the very needy group, including me, who will need the NHS to be redesigned and for primary care to be strengthened and invested in so that we can be looked after should we need it as we get older. The idea is we should all be exercising sufficiently to make sure we don't need much. That's one good bit. Facing the fact that many of us will have problems either through bad luck or by ill behaviour, we're going to have to deal with that, and general practice and primary care have to have the capacity to do it. The way we're set up is not ready for that yet, and we're now at capacity. So I would, and I will, appeal to the Scottish Government and all politicians to say it's time to invest in general practice and community care, because that's where the care is needed, and we need to start doing that now.
My apologies to Richard Lyle, who I overlooked on my list. Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Dr McDivitt, I've listened to you intently, and I do remember the good old days of the doctors, and I've been lucky in my life. I see my doctor about once every 8 or 9 or 10 years, but you see people regular all the time. And the point you made earlier about self-assessment and housing letters and bath letters, and can you give me a letter for a shower, doctor? I came across them in the 36 years I was a local government councillor. Can I suggest that what's happening is driving a wedge between doctors and patients? I've got a couple of questions, but basically, are you saying this is what's basically is happening? A wedge has been driven because. Can I go back to how did the person get the money in the first place? How did they get their assessment? They got a letter from the doctor. If you want to go back 5, 10, 15 years, whatever, the doctor at some process was involved in it, and the person being assessed and getting the under the DWP rules at that time. So now the doctor's been asked to reassess them. So how do you equate the start of the assessment and now to be re-asked to go back over what you already have told the DWP?
I think there's a danger of conflating the different types of benefit here. I mean, predominantly I've been talking about the ESA,
Yeah.
but we're also going to be talking about DLA and A and the PIP as it's changing into now. So there are different aspects, but in terms of ESA, for example, to begin with, we will write a sick or fit note as it is now for patients. And after 13 weeks, DWP will decide whether or not they are fit for work, some work, or any work. So it's out of my hands after that point. Now, normally, the way I was thinking of this, and when we had the old system, I would expect to be asked for a report before they made the decision about fitness to work or not. And that's where I was saying I'm not sure if the proportion of patients being at, or the number of times the DWP asked me, my impression used to be they always asked me before they decided somebody was fit or not in the longer term. It seems now they don't under the new process. They don't think that's necessary. And you could argue that may be true, because maybe if it's based on function and not diagnosis, then that may be appropriate. So I'm just saying there are arguments around that. So we will have, my general conception is I'll have given fit notes, which is a brief description of the problem. I will usually have been asked at some point for a more detailed description of the health problem, and then the DWP will make a decision based on that. And they used to periodically, every 2 years or so, say, is this still the situation or not, or have things changed? So that was normal. I think perhaps you're straying in perhaps to things like DLA and attendance allowance, where there's a more in-depth form, and I have some of them here, not anonymised, so I can't show you them in detail, but that's a more extensive form, which does look at more at function as well, and asks more detailed information for me where I have it on function for patients, and I will have filled that in for someone at some point. That is separately paid for because it's not part of the contract, and we get, I think, £30 for doing one of the reports. So that is something I don't want obliged to do it either, but we would do it and we get that payment from the DWP. So that will have happened at some point, and then there's a periodic review where we may be asked to say again, has something changed? The difference now is the patient may not have changed, but the thresholds have changed. So they're going to reapply new thresholds to the old information, and therefore they may or may not choose to ask me for additional information because they may feel they already have it and they're just going to apply it to a new threshold and change their opinion. So I haven't seen so many of those types of requests from for DLA and AA in terms of review, but I think it's happening. I suspect again it's happened geographically in terms of as DWP works through patients. So I'm no doubt I will be asked that, but I suspect it will be less the medical information that changes than that the thresholds applied will be different.
Yeah. Would you? I'd like to ask both of you, Teresa and yourself. Would you agree that all this reassessment has a cost, and that cost actually may outweigh the savings that we're going to, or the DWP or the UK government, not the Scottish government, the UK government wants to save, and all these possibly thousands of people being reassessed, being seen in tranches, if you think, and I think maybe that can you re-emphasise that? I caught a word or a quote you said there earlier, false extra work. You did say that, and I'll check the record, and if I'm wrong, I'll apologise. But would you like to comment on all this reassessment and the cost it's going to be? Will it save any money, or will it be basically a knock-on cost again?
I think, to be fair, it's probably with my expertise and knowledge to answer that question. I mean, I can only comment in terms of what it takes from medical time, and that's what we've talked a lot about today. The cost in terms of doing this instead of doing what patients need is the main cost to us. And obviously, when you see figures which have been said about 38% of people achieving on appeal, that means that it's taken a second go to get the right decision. So that has doubled the work to get to the end result, which was the right decision. So at the very least, that will have wasted, if I did say false work, it'll be around that, or indeed creating a system where the norm is that you get the right decision on appeal, and you have to have spent extra resources of the patient's time, the professional's time, and the system's time in order to get the right appeal, when in fact everyone's time would have been saved, and it would have been cheaper and more effective to make the right decision on the first go. So if I said something about false work, it would be about, I don't want to encourage the process of, yes, let's just all massively go for a massive appeal system, because that means you're doing twice the work to get to the right decision. So that would be if I did say that, it would be around that aspect of the work.
I would absolutely agree. We don't know the figures, but we imagine it's, you know, millions of pounds that are being wasted and having to go round and round, and people winning, 40% of people winning on appeals for some benefits. But I would go further than say it's about a waste of money or costing the taxpayer money, and say that often the outcome is not going to lead to a disabled person or a person with long-term conditions getting a job, because of the complex interrelated barriers that I spoke about before. And even if we just talk about discrimination, if I disclose that I have MS, that is much more likely to lead to me not getting a job. So the outcomes are not necessarily going to be that disabled people get into work. So it's not just going to have a cost in terms of the process that's being carried out. It's going to have a cost in terms of what's going to happen to the people, their health, their illnesses. Last night at the conference with housing associations in Glasgow, we heard that suicides were up to 4 a week in Glasgow, 1 a week in the East End. We heard that if you start on the underground map at the top right-hand side and work down to the bottom left, you lose a year of your life at every station. You know, these kind of figures were presented, and this has all got worse. So the costs are not just about people's, you know, about money, they're about people's lives as well.
Can I say, you know, before I go on to my next question, I admire what doctors do, and I admire what you and your organisation do, Teresa. Basically, last week I attended a bedroom tax meeting, View Park, Uddingston, and the whistleblower who whistleblowed on Atos was there. I'll not give it a name. Their opinion was a very low opinion of Atos, and basically they said, you know, the questions that people are being asked, how far, you were talking earlier about how far can you walk, do you have a dog? Well, if you have a dog, that means you can walk because you're taking the dog for a walk. You know, do you think that some of the questions being asked by Atos are loaded in order to ensure that they can get people off the system very quickly? And as I say, again, I have to say that, you know, it's all been loaded onto doctors, and they're getting the unfair, and I can see where you're coming from in regards to the point that, you know, it's creating a barrier between your patient and yourselves, because, you know, the blame's been shifted onto you. You know, but what is honestly your opinion of Atos and some of the questions that have been asked? You may not know some of the questions, but just give a general opinion.
I have to say, because I have to be careful, I'm representing the BMA here, which is a large organisation with many diverse views, but I think the decision made at the ARM and discussions in the profession are that many doctors have serious concerns about the current Atos process, and that's what was the basis of the ARM motion, which was accepted last year, and indeed at the LMC motion, the Scottish LMC conference this year. So I think there are many doctors who have serious concerns that the system is designed, you would say, to reduce the number of people who might benefit from it. I think my personal opinion is that's my opinion as a doctor, working doctor, not as a medical politician, or somebody who's got inside knowledge, but that the impression seems to be that more people are getting harsher treatment, and that the threshold has become much higher to achieve benefits, and people who previously were thought to be in need of that benefit, whose situation hasn't changed, they're no less distressed or unwell or disabled, but are now not getting that benefit and are being asked to enter into a work-seeking situation, which at the very least they tell me is extremely stressful and doesn't seem to help their health. And their chances of getting employment, in my area in particular, seem pretty remote, I have to say. And would I, as an employer, employ some of these people? Well, the answer is probably not. I wouldn't expect them to be able to do a good day's work. So now that's a political decision, and it's right that governments are the people who will be both responsible for that and should argue about whether it's fair or not, and we should all engage in the political process to say that. But I think it's true that many doctors think that the process which is now being instigated and Atos is contracted to provide by the UK government is a harsher system intended to have fewer people receiving benefits. But that is my view of what I think many doctors think, and isn't strictly a BMA view. The BMA view is expressed in the reports and the ARM motions.
You're not seriously asking me what disabled people think Atos, but allowed to swear. Well, I can speak
Yeah,
for...
you have, with the greatest respect to you, you have possibly 5 minutes. I'm sure you could speak for at least the
Okay.
next 2 hours in Atos,
Okay.
but and the short, so the convener's not concerned, and the shortest, I don't want to take it away from you, but how do you
No.
feel about Atos?
Disabled people have reported to me that their experiences of going through the processes of ATOS are humiliating and degrading, unfair. I think that's really important because notwithstanding the occasions that you mentioned about the times where you can't believe people, we know the stats from DWP themselves are that 0.0 something% of people are committing fraud. We know that the majority of people are telling the truth, and yet they are finding it extremely painful to go through those processes. And we had a day at the end of January in Glasgow, Inclusion Scotland and ourselves with our members to celebrate Holocaust Memorial Day, and ATOS was mentioned again and again, and the parallels were drawn with people feeling prejudice and stigma and discrimination, and the parallels were drawn with ATOS people just following orders, and where does that take you? So I won't say any more than that.
Thank you for that. Thank you, convener.
Just, after hearing all that we have heard this morning and, where the politics lie and where the policy has come from, I mean, under the recommendations from yourself, I don't know what flows out of this, but there, and indeed what we've heard earlier, whether the GPs who don't really want to be involved in this situation or, caught in it. But I think you mentioned that the Scottish Government has a duty under the Equality Act. What does that mean in real terms, in terms of your recommendations? GPs should be supported by the Scottish Government, the health boards. What do you mean by that? And indeed, the other area that hasn't really been covered here this morning in terms of, we've got some experience of that and other situations about local government and the social work arm, and reports and assessments there being used or indeed asked to confirm certain things about the Bedroom Act, how the bedroom's used. So practically, as I related to earlier, how do we as a committee get to a stage where we're bringing all of these agencies together to manage a situation that we don't want? And it would be useful if you could give just a bit of further comment on some of the recommendations that you have highlighted in your written submission to help us maybe in our thinking towards who would we need to get together to actually get a practical, pragmatic response that improves the situation for people who are facing, worry and panic at this time, and at least be with them at that time.
I think when we refer to the Equality Act, we're talking about the duty to promote equality and reduce inequality, particularly for disabled people, and there's a positive duty in the Act. But not just the Equality Act, also there's a duty to promote human rights positively on Scottish ministers, and to reduce the inequalities that disabled people are experiencing. So that's what we meant in terms of the legislation, and we can give you more information on that. But the practical steps, I think I already referred to earlier, the idea of agencies having to pay for the money up front. I referred back to the Welfare Reform Committee's report that was done on this, and the mention made of Professor Harrington's report about how the information provided wasn't being used to its best advantage, and how some of the descriptors that the information was being fed into weren't actually taking account of what GPs were saying in the first place, which meant it was having to go to appeal. So I think there is something about discussions and meetings with DWP and looking at it right from the front end of the system. I think in terms of, even if we look at the Reshaping Care for Older People strategy, and there has had to be time to the process, but what has been very positive and productive has been bringing people together, including the third sector, potentially the independent sector as well, and looking at people working together on solutions. So as I said earlier, organisations like Citizens Advice Bureaus and disabled people's organisations are already part of this process and may be able to come up with some solutions. But notwithstanding all of that, that, I don't think we can get away from the fact that GPs need further resources to be enabled, particularly in the deep end situations, to actually have more time to dedicate to filling these forms in whilst all that's going on, because there's the crisis of where we are and there's the longer term process of fixing it out, and I think we need to deal with both at the same time, step by step.
Thank you for that. I don't think there is any other questions. Can I thank you both for your time and your evidence that you've provided to the committee this morning, and we will consider that and communicate with the Minister and others, I presume. Thank you very, very much for your time this morning.
That's the end of the public part of the meeting.
And that brings us in to the end of the public part of the meeting, and we go into private session as previously agreed. Thank you.